Back with Season 9, Episode 20, updated it properly this time. A Horseshoe-In. This is the episode in which Starlight is being given the, excuse me, the head mare position, and she's like, I need a VP. I need a vice head mare. So she goes about, and it's totally going to be Trixie. Wink. So, I mean, I like this episode. I like Trixie and I like Starlight, so what the hell do you want from me? But I do think this is actually a pretty good episode. And honestly, I think it only stumbles twice. So that's pretty good. Let's get this out of the way right now. This is very obviously an arc counter. And we're just going to give 10 continuity counters. Because there's a lot. I didn't bother counting because at a certain point I just can't keep up. So I'm going to do all that over there. Leave that be. So, Phyllis. I don't know what else to say about that. Usual animation mention. Yeah, exactly. It's just, so they come out. Spike is like, all right, here we go. Here's the thing. Reading the announcement. If you notice how fast he's going through that scroll as he's reading, is he reading like text like this all you? It's just, oh my god. Anyway, sorry. So, regardless, Starlight had an entire story arc about learning to be accepted as a manager. In fact, it's actually one of my favorite two-parters. So she's super nervous, but you notice that she actually feels like she can do this. And I only bother to point that out. I shouldn't even have to. I shouldn't even have to mention this stuff. But I point it out because it is acknowledgement of character arc. It is acknowledgement of the fact that the character is shuffled forwards. In fact, frankly, Twilight has actually been shuffling forward too, if you're paying attention. Another interesting thing to note, one of the things I've been tracking across this show is how many episodes are focused on how many characters. Now, I find this useful from a creative perspective, but also from a management perspective. In fact, I'm doing this with the Star Trek Rewrite as well, because it's a good way to see, well, you know, which characters are we focusing on and which ones are we not, to try and balance that out a little bit. We never want to get to the point of obviously trying to be completely balanced, but at the same time, if we have 15 Twilight episodes and 3, I don't know, Pinkie Pie episodes, then maybe we need to redress that balance a little bit. The reason I point this out is some of you may have noticed on the spreadsheet that I've actually already got most of those numbers, and by most I mean all of those numbers, up through Season 8 done. And it is certainly interesting to see the spread, because the number of episodes that are focusing entirely on Twilight are diminishing a bit by bit over time, and I think we're seeing more of this in Season 9 as well, which makes sense, since mostly she's stopped being a main character and moved to being an NPC, just like Celestia. Now, I'm not sure if this is done on purpose or not, but I have enough trust and faith in the writers that this actually makes sense to me, that they are pushing her to the role of the authoritative character. Have you noticed that? Because that's been true for several episodes now. You know, she has basically been sliding back to where Celestia used to sit narratively, and she'll show up, for 2 or 3 scenes in an episode to give good advice, and then go back to being Thing, right? So yeah, no, this tracks. This makes perfect sense. Interesting. And again, I would believe, well, we gotta have time for Trivial Pursuit. I would believe this is on purpose. I have this. We talk about this so many times, how much faith you have in the writers of a given work as to whether something is accidental or deliberate. I think this is deliberate. But anyways. So, Trixie is naturally worried about losing friend time. Gosh, that sounds familiar. But I'm vaguely amused that they go in and Twilight's trying to figure out how to fold the things, and Starlight folds it perfectly immediately. But she gets the idea from Trixie of, I should get a vice headmare, which is actually a pretty good idea. There's nothing wrong with getting someone else to help you do the freaking job. This is true in almost every respect, and whether regarding to running a school, or running a classroom, or running a business, or running an office, or running a country, or running a city. Like, there's a reason that those type of jobs do tend to exist. There's a lot of work that piles up, and having an assistant is good. I've talked about this so many times. A valuable assistant is someone who is basically necessary. And I specifically mentioned a classroom there because even if you go way down to all you're managing is one classroom full of kids, there's still a lot of work to be done. And yeah, I was going to say, Starlight was already effectively the VP for Twilight. They mentioned that in this episode. How Starlight has gotten used to taking over the school for her whenever Starlight was up, or excuse me, whenever Twilight was off going and saving the world, or whatever she was up to that particular week. So I'm with it. Listen, I can't just give you the job. Wink. Okay, I'm gonna be real. Trixie's wink is a plus by itself. Thank you, Darth Tyron, as always. Enjoy D&D. Much appreciated. I'll jot that down for Tor, which we may be shoving more forward than I thought if things keep going the way they have been. We'll see. Got a lot of dealer's choice ready to just dump on Tor if I have to. Anyways, so I'm sorry. I don't want to repeat the joke too much, but this is how they do. There's such a thing as repetition humor, and I've talked about this before. Now, typical repetition humor is 3 beats. Like, I've talked about the math and formulas of humor before. In fact, I've done that recently in the episode about cheese sandwich. Introduce, establish, fulfill. That's the 3 beats of humor. And this is a very, very, very common pattern. But there is such a thing as using repetition for humor deliberately. Anybody who's seen Family Guy is actually pretty familiar with this kind of concept, because there's actually this sine wave of repetition when it comes to humor. And the problem is it's variable depending on the individual. But the way it works is you start out and it's funny, and then you repeat it too much, and it stops being funny. But then you keep repeating it, and it actually goes back up to being funny again, because the joke becomes how much you're repeating it. If you're paying attention, it's actually 2 separate jokes. There's the joke, and then there's the fact that you're repeating the joke. I actually have a really weird example of this for you, for those of you who have ever seen RoboCop. I know that's a weird example, but let me put it to you this way. So this is a mild spoiler, but there's a scene in RoboCop where there's this giant mech with autocannons, which just shoots up a guy in an office. Yeah, the shooting scene. You know where I'm talking about that. Now, that scene, just what I described, that's horrifying. Oh my god! But then it keeps shooting him. Okay, that's horrific. But then it keeps shooting him. Why is it such a... And then it keeps shooting him! And it just kind of... It becomes... The repetition itself pulls it back up to being fun. And yeah, it gets to the point where it goes from being nightmarish and horrific to being funny. And that's that sine wave of repetition and how you can use that. And yeah, whose line is it anyways, for anybody who's seen that, is a good example of this. Call a doctor! He just got shot for like 5 minutes. It's actually like 30 seconds, but still, 30 seconds is a long time to be shot. Trust me. Anyways, and yeah, just last episode, Rarity and her dramatic apology with the 3 beats is a perfect example of the three patterns. So I mention this because that's exactly what they do with the wink, is they just wink and then wink. And if you pay attention, she actually winks 3 times in the initial conversation. You know, introduction, establishment, fulfillment. But then she keeps winking and keeps winking and keeps winking. And that's when it starts to actually develop into the second joke, as I mentioned earlier. So, we get our applicants for Vice Head Mayor. Now, what I like about this is it's mentioned twice in the episode that these are actually people who have applied. In other words, she didn't seek out anyone. People sought out her. That's actually an important thing to keep in mind. I just want you to remember that for the end of the episode. So we have Spoiled Milk... I wrote them down. Spoiled Milk, Dr. Hooves, Octavia, Big Mac, and, of course, Trixie. Now, just looking at that group, I'd say, okay, that's a terrible lineup. No, I mean that. That's a pretty terrible lineup. I wouldn't pick any of those people to be Vice Head Mayor personally, but I'll get past that for the moment. Wink. So we start doing successful elimination. I want to talk briefly about this because I like to talk about management stuff, because someday I'm going to take over the world and I'm going to have to do so much management. So right now I'm making management a hobby so that after I take over the world and becomes my job, I'm at least a little bit more ready for it, right? So what they do is what is referred to as elimination interviewing. Now, there's 2 broad strokes to do this kind of multi-tier interview process. The first is elimination, and the second is grading, excuse me. So elimination means you have to pass the first thing in order to even do the second. You have to pass the second, even do the third, and so forth and so on. So that's why it's called elimination. The benefit of this is if the goal you have is someone who fulfills all requirements, then elimination means that you can remove people from the board who don't fulfill those requirements. I don't like elimination interviewing because I think it sucks. There are two very big problems with elimination interviewing. The first and most obvious is stuff happens. Every now and again, things go wrong or badly, or there's issues, or they have a bad day, or they have a bad circumstance, or whatever. And basically making it a pass-fail binary thing in order to be able to keep going forward might work for a game show, but for something more serious like an interview, doesn't really have the nuance and gradients it needs. Yeah, you can have a bad day. Problem number two is the fact that you are presuming a flawed precept before you even walk into the whole situation, that there is such a thing as someone who fulfills all your requirements. That's not how real life works. Generally speaking, what you want is, let's say you have 5 requirements, okay? If you get someone who has these 4 or these 4 or these 4, then that's a good pick, generally speaking, depending, of course, because not everything's equal. You know, sometimes this thing over here is substantially more important, you know, being able to get along well with the kids, for example, in this exact circumstance. So this is something that you really want, but if someone stumbles at this step but is otherwise good at it, I mean, you get the general idea. So yeah, exactly, Roscoe. There's one thing that's very important, or 2 or 3, and then the rest are kind of bonus material. So if you do a grading scale, which is not an elimination process, you could say, well, you didn't do well at this or this, but you did very well at this or this, and this is something that's really important to me for this job, so you're hired, right? Yes, I've done interviews. Shut up. Long time ago. I developed a whole process. We had a bit of theater going on for it. It was funny. I was the quote-unquote bad cop. I was I was just there in a suit, not saying anything, while the other guy was actually doing the interview. And the whole goal was, this is actually mean in hindsight, but I was gauging their reactions. I was paying very close attention to how they would react to questions, and not really paying attention to their actual answers to questions. And so I was gauging the people, if that makes sense. But the whole point was I was just sitting there, you know, straight-faced, in a suit, just... And some people were like, he's just an observer, don't worry about him. And, you know, just throwing them a little bit off their ball there. But anyways, I don't want to get into that. The point is, moving on. Yeah, we'll talk about nepotism, too, because that's a fun one. What, Bragwin? And yeah, Darth Tyrant's correct. Sometimes there are outliers. That's also very true. And yeah, there's also some issues with regards to pay, and there's a whole lot that goes into this whole thing. But let's go ahead and scooch forward. So, Big Mac is cool. Spoiled Rich. This is funny. Spoiled Rich says something. Nothing gets you loyalty more than a big stack of bits. Actually, historically speaking, that's not true. If you actually dig back through it, because of course I've studied mercenary history because I love economics, war, and history. Most of the time, mercenaries would, of course, fight and do battles, but if you are sending the mercenary into, for example, a mission to die or whatever, then it doesn't matter how much you're paying them, they're out. And if the fight starts to go bad, they break almost immediately. This is why in a lot of strategy games, mercenary units tend to have very, very low morale bar, aka the morale gets to 0, they're out. So, sure, you can start to buy loyalty with money, but you can't actually buy loyalty with money. It historically doesn't work that way. Yeah, I wasn't even going to bring that one up, Trathan. Or Ect gives several wonderful little examples of there as well. And of course, there's the entire Punic War problem, if we want to go back even further. This is not a new issue, right? So, that sucks. I just wanted to point that out because despite being a rich pony, you could tell that she's a rich pony. I'm sorry, I should clarify that. There's a difference between someone who's rich and someone who's good with money. Someone who's good with money is usually not rich. Someone who's good with money is usually hired by someone who is rich to manage their money for them. Statistically speaking, most rich people are actually very bad with money. Now, Spoiled, in this case, is even worse, because, as we've discussed before, she actually married into wealth. So, she's terrible with money, and she shows it. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across, is it's made very clear that, ignoring the fact that she's obviously a terrible teacher, she's also really actively wrong. I actually agree. Pinky is probably very good with money. She definitely has the organizational skills to do that. In fact, frankly, I would think Rarity is also probably quite good with money. I mean, she hasn't gone under, and she keeps opening new boutiques, so something's going right. So, Octavia does the thing. Dr. Hooves comes up with a little Rube Goldberg machine to feed the bird. That's kind of cool. And then we get to Trixie. In 1322, Abraxias the Bold... No, don't leave me hanging! She never finishes. I don't know what Abraxias the Bold did. God damn it! Alright, so real talk. Trixie mentions something in passing that is actually a gigantic topic, which I'm going to only briefly cover. She says, okay, I know history is important, but I never learned it, and look how I turned out. Alright, real talk. How many of you have used some of the lessons... let me lock that back. How many of you have used all of the lessons you learned back in school in your everyday life after getting out of school? Trig? There's a fun one. How many of you have done Trig? Yeah, I noticed that Trixie got the hard job there. Making history interesting is possible. There's a lot of YouTube channels that do that for a living. Well, that's sort of my point, though, Lord Harrimont. Because obviously some of the stuff you did. What's the ratio, though? The reason I bring this up and the reason this is a topic, it's actually two topics in one, which we just hinted at, but to try and, like I said, I could talk about this for hours. The problem here is what they do here in the States. I'm not actually sure in other countries, so forgive me. But here in the States, what they do is they say, hey, we're going to try and give you a very surface level introduction to everything. Now, that's kind of a controversial topic, but I'm going to go and just admit that I think that is a mistake. I think trying to swing the net that far and that wide for that many years sucks. That is my opinion. I want you to hate everything, Lord Harrimont. Now don't mistake me. I do think whoosh is a decent idea, but the problem here in the States is they do whoosh for God, how many... Let me think about this for a second. 10 years. 13 years if you really want to count it. But at least 10 years from what I went through. 10 years of whoosh. What? I'm sorry, I could point to my niece, who hasn't even started that 10-year arc I just mentioned, and I could already tell you stuff that is already catching her attention. So starting off with a nice big... net thing makes sense. You want people to have the basics of a lot of things, right? But by the time you get to high school, why do I have to take trigonometry? Because it's required. Why? And you see my point here? The problem here is there's actually a huge amount of issues with this overall topic. Because, Sean says, how would I trim it? The problem is I can't give you a one-sentence answer to that. The way I would trim it is I would look at the jigsaw that is the American education system, and you'd be like, okay, hang on. This shouldn't be here. This shouldn't be here. This should be here. This should be moved over here. Because the problem is I think there's basically everything wrong with it. But not completely, because not everything is completely wrong. So, yeah, it needs to be a fairly massive overhaul. Yeah, exactly, Ross. There are classes that I absolutely think... Why don't we teach time management in school, in grade school, never mind in high school? Time management, how relevant do you think that is for most livelihood situations? And you see my overall mentality there. Things that are more broadly relevant are things that we should probably at least try to get people an education in. How to manage money, how to manage time, basics of math, because math, low-level math, is something that we use every frickin' day, right? Trying to have an understanding of history. I do think we do need to have at least a vague understanding of where we came from and what's going on. Trying to understand at least a little bit of certain aspects of, how chemistry works and how biology works and so forth and so on. And actually, it's funny you say that, Lord Haremont, because I learned most of what I learned in school, I learned entirely on the extracurricular stuff. Like, I've talked several times about how I took television productions, but that was just like one semester of one class. And if you're looking at me weird, it's because I've talked about doing television productions for years. That's because I kept doing it on my own time, out of the school. And I learned a great deal during that time. I still, to this day, apply some of the lessons I learned in high school. You'll never have a calculator in your pocket in the real world? Yeah, I will. Yeah, nutrition. That's actually another good one. Nutrition is absolutely valid. And yeah, exactly. I wanted to learn it. I wanted it. I was hungry for it, so I did. You know, nobody was telling me I have to go play frickin' Jekyll and Hyde and Jekyll and Hyde. I wanted to do that, and I fought for it. Now, okay, I do need to back up and say, in the interest of fairness, I'm probably one of the most ambitious people I know. I have always been very driven, even as a child, and my sister endlessly makes fun of me for it. So, I'm probably not the best case study here. I'm just going to go ahead and be honest about that. But I still absolutely think that getting a broad education early and then offering education later is something that we can and should do with our educational system. You know, you have to go to school, you have to learn something, but what is it you want to learn? How do you want to learn it? Where do you want to go? Yeah, focus it more. Get it in. I've talked about this before on this very show, because a good counselor and a good career counselor is absolutely critical. Hell, I've talked about this on my Star Trek stuff too, because it's just as relevant over there. Not everyone wants to learn A, Y, or Z, and guess what? I couldn't tell you jack about trig off the top of my head. I did take trig, I got an A. I don't remember anything about it right now. I couldn't even tell you what trigonometry means off the top of my head. I hate to keep making fun of trig, but it's a great example, you know? It was also mandatory, which is kind of my point. Sorry for going way off topic on this. It's just... I mean, I may or may not have used trig in my life. I have no idea. It's possible. I have a pretty good memory. The point is, let's cut back to the episode for a second. The point is, she flat out says, why bother learning history? I didn't learn history and I turned out fine. This is basically the terribleness in every way. Granted, yes, I'm a history geek. I'm going to admit that. I just admitted that earlier today. But I absolutely do think you need to learn history. At least a little bit of history. I am a very fervent believer in the fact that if people do not know their history, it leads to problems. I can prove that, but I'm not going to, because this isn't Halloween. So, she's a stage performer. This is the other way this is wrong. Her job, yeah, geography too, absolutely. Her literal job is to perform and be entertaining. Get up there and tell the story of Abraxas the Bold. To try to make it interesting. I'd like to think that I can do that kind of job, and if I can, surely she can. Regardless, and yeah, the problem is she doesn't care, which is a huge issue, because that's the third thing that I've been trying to avoid. But Raskor brought it up, so now I'm going to rant about teachers who don't care. No, that's not fair. You know what I'm going to rant about is a system that de-incentivizes caring. Now, again, I don't actually know about how other countries do this, but here in the States, there is literally a systemic problem with de-incentivizing teachers with giving a damn. They have mandated things, they have requirements, they have a laundry list of rules that they have to follow, which severely restrict what they can and can't do, mostly for lawsuit-related reasons, and they do not get the backing they need. And yes, pay is one of those things, but I mean, they don't get backing. They don't get support, they don't get resources, they don't get supplies, they don't get time, they don't get assistance. They get what they get. That's it. So of course they don't care. Or at least some of them don't. Obviously, there are exceptions. I myself can actually point to teachers in my real-life history that have obviously cared. I can also point to quite a few who didn't. Teachers Union. You're funny. Oh. Teachers Union isn't doing its damn job. Anyways, so... So forgive me for just going way off on this topic for like 10 minutes, but... This one scene of Trixie being a bad history teacher, it speaks so much, right? It says so much. Okay, so moving on, we should actually probably talk about the episode a little bit here. Right. Wink. So they go in, and I love, by the way, that they show the pictures. Trixie submitted it. We see a bit the picture Trixie had, and it's her going, like little special effects. I just thought that was cute. So this is when Starlight brings up a very fascinating topic, which unfortunately they don't address or discuss, because it itself is another one of those complex topics. And that topic is, it would be so much fun to have my vice headmare be a friend. The thing is, this is a complex situation. I'm not bringing up the nepotism yet. I am going to bring it up later. Because the thing here is, let's just focus entirely on the idea of having your coworker or your VP or your whatever be a friend of yours. Someone you get along with. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't. Let's ignore the nepotism. Let's throw that out the window. For right now, the only thing that matters is, let's say that you have a choice between two equally competent people, and one of them is a friend and one of them isn't. Which do you pick? Now, of course, the answer is, it depends. Because, yeah, the reason office romances are usually a bad idea is because all of both types of relationships, which are very different relationships, tend to bleed over to each other. And I'm not even getting into power dynamics and all that other crap. So yeah, most of the time you don't want to be that person with someone else. Forgive me for quoting questionable content. There's a bit where Dora is hiring some of her friends to fill out the staff at the Coffee of Doom. And in the process she says, all right, look, when we're on duty, I am the boss first and your friend second. And then they turn it into a joke because the questionable content is a comedic comic. But the point is, that does need to be the first sentence. When we're on the clock, I am your boss first. I'm your friend second. And yeah, actually, I was going to say, we actually had this with Rarity, too. You're right. Now, I agree with Darth Tyrant. A real friend, this will work out with. Because even if there's an issue on the job, it won't bleed over to your friendship because they know, because they're a real friend, that you did what you had to do or said what you had to say because you were their boss. And that doesn't bleed over, right? The catch is the real part of that real friend statement. So, it's another one of those interesting and nuanced things that the episode barely addresses. And it just kind of brings it up in one brief scene and then moves on. There's a lot of that going on lately, isn't there? But this then leads to another wonderfully complex topic. Parent-teacher conferences. Now, and yeah, good point, Weods. The main six, they're real friends. They job first, friend second, and it kind of works. Now, before we talk about the specifics of the episode and the scene, I just want to say something really quick. How many of you at the schools you were at had parents, teachers, or both, who dreaded and hated parent-teacher conferences? Now, that's already a problem, to be blunt. It does depend, of course. Depends on the school, depends on the teacher, depends on the parents. But the problem is there's a fairly, at least a recurrent element of, PT conferences. Right? Now, I hate that because that is a horrible, horrible problem. The whole point of a parent-teacher conference, which is something I'm extremely in favor of, by the way, is to involve the parent in the teaching process. That is the core central point of those kind of conferences. That's the reason you do that. Here's how this is going. Here's why it's going this way. maybe we have some ideas, maybe we work through it. Maybe your particular student has some learning disabilities, or maybe they just think differently than other kids do, or maybe we're not engaging them just right. Right? Actually properly sharing back and forth, but... Sorry. I'm not going to get up on the soapbox again. I think I already broke it earlier when I was talking about education. The point being that these are something that should be a valuable and critical element of a child's upbringing. Because teaching and parentage do kind of blend over a little bit, and they should. My opinion. My opinion. So, Octavia speaks. That's amusing. And Dr. Hooves is doing his own thing. He does a really good job here, actually. And then poor Big Mac, who... It's funny, we know Big Mac can talk, but they really... It's done for a joke, but they really line this up. I'm just not quite getting the nuance of the thing. But then we cut to Trixie. Now, I know several people have said this in chat, but allow me to firmly agree, Trixie is very in the right here. Now... It may or may not interest you to note that in some states, what Trixie did is actually not only legally protected, but can lead to her actually being capable of calling into question parentage, depending, obviously. What I mean by that is, let's say that there's a student that comes in, and the parent just does not give a crap, and is completely de-engaged from this. Parent, guardian, doesn't really matter. And if the teacher says, what the crap is wrong with you? If you don't care, why are you here? It does everything that Trixie did, then that teacher is in the right. And Trixie was absolutely in the right. And yeah, this is when we possibly get social workers involved. Yeah, poor Gallus, who's just sitting over there being neglected. Good word, Sean, thank you. Just being neglected. He just looks so downtrodden. And Trixie is straight up standing up for him, as she should. It actually irritates me a little bit that I thought the episode was going to slant Trixie as in the wrong here. Thankfully, it didn't do that. I was going to be pissed if it did. But no, she puts her hoof down and says, no, this has to happen, and this has to happen this way. Trixie gave a damn. And what did we just talk about with regards to teaching? So, I'm with that. And that's, ironically, it's actually some good foreshadowing, too. Because she's stupid and she's a bad teacher, but she definitely cares. So credit where credit is due. And that's important because, you know, of how the episode ends, but we'll get there in a minute. So, I actually wrote down some of these specific lines of dialogue, by the way, just to really make this point. Grandpa Gruff says, Gallus doesn't need to know I'm proud of him. I can't even do it. I can't get the disdain in my voice. And Trixie says, well, good, because you're no longer welcome here. And, of course, this then leads to the one moment where I was ready to tear the episode a new one, because Starlight says, you can't get into a shouting match with guardians or parents. Yes, you can. Depending, obviously. And some would argue it's not professional. But no, again, in this exact case, let's not get into generics. In this exact case, she absolutely was in the right to get into a shouting match with that jackass. So, Starlight finally lays it out honestly with Trixie, which is interesting because she's been kind of hiding it up until now. Possibly Trihexia, but yeah. And yeah, sorry, I was going to mention, did you notice that they actually had a minor background plot point just last episode about how Gallus is... There's tons of letters about how Gallus is doing at the... Is it because he's being a dick and doesn't want to admit that he cares? Is it because someone else is writing those letters in his name? I don't know what's actually going on there. But either way, I just thought I'd mention it because it's a weird kind of... I mean, yeah, it could just be the old man thing. You're not supposed to show emotions. Lead paint thing. But, I love I'll constantly talk about how amazing the animation in the show is. There's this bit where she throws a smoke bomb, and then she very carefully and kind of awkwardly, ungracefully tumbles off the desk and then walks away. I just love the way they animated that. So, Starlight lays it out honestly for Trixie. This is the second way in which the episode stumbles. Trixie is too stupid in this episode. She's Goku. Or Sora from Kingdom Hearts, or whatever example you want to use. She is a little bit too stupid, and it actually does diminish the episode's strength, because there's a scene later on where Starlight tells her something 3 times in a row, more bluntly each time, and it takes until the final time for Trixie to actually pick up on what she's saying. We'll get back to that in a minute. Nevertheless, it's time to do a field trip. So we're going to do a field trip. So naturally, Octavia does a classical musical performance with DJ Pongs, which is awesome. And then Dr. Hooves does time travel, immediate cut to Starlight. I like that. It's a nice touch. It also refers to the oldest time-traveling joke that exists. No, seriously, I myself have heard this time-traveling joke while streaming, while talking about time travel. We're all time travelers, Lore. Sorry, I've heard it before. A few dozen times. But yeah, I like her reaction of just, which type of time travel is this one? Bam! Alright, there we go. So, this then leads to Trixie saying, I'm totally going to make this awesome, and I'm going to bring the field trip to us! First of all, I want to say that's actually impressive at how much better at her teleportation she's gotten. That is something. Credit where credit is due. It is, of course, very Trixie. And I mean this is a good thing, because Trixie is actually pretty good about the charisma, about the presentation, but not a lot about actually thinking about what she's doing. So naturally she didn't think about what she's doing, and it turns into a mess. Pretty Trixie. Starlight comes in. Nice little bit of character moment here. Starlight is willing to admit and express how angry she is to Trixie, which is something she had an entire episode about, if you're remembering. So, she leans into Trixie. This is when Trixie, is stupid. Starlight has a specific line, which I wrote out here. Twilight's friend... So Trixie says, Twilight's friends always help her. And Starlight says, that's because they're competent. They care about what they're doing, and they know how to do it. Ouch. And the really, really horrible thing here is that Starlight is actually correct in this. No, really. This ties into everything we were talking about earlier. So, we've mentioned nepotism a few times. Nepotism has 2 definitions. I've actually brought this up before. There's the literal definition, which is hiring someone who is a family member or a friend. That's it. That's the literal definition. Or there's the implication, what people usually mean when they say nepotism, which is hiring someone, because, friend or family member or loved one, who is not qualified. And that's a key and important distinction, because I myself am actually a fairly big practicer of the former. And I mean that. I do know my friends and my family, and I know what they're good at. I know what kind of jobs they should have. Right? And yeah, it's funny because this very episode does practice good nepotism. In fact, it even highlights good nepotism with that comment. The main 6, and Weouts brought this up earlier, the main 6 have been doing a pretty good job in their roles. They have been good teachers, and they've been doing a good staff. And Sunburst is a good pick for Vice Headmare. We got lucky because it turns out Flurry Heart has been growing up off camera, making Flurry Heart the only character to grow up in this show. But, nevertheless, he is a good pick. Good nepotism, for lack of a better way to phrase that. Trixie would be bad nepotism, because she's not qualified for the job that she's trying to be shoved into, right? Ironically, they then turn this around and say, well, hang on, we have a different position that you might be better for. And that's exactly my point. As weird as it may sound, the nepotism itself shouldn't actually be a part of this equation. More so, what should be a part of the equation is who's good for what? Who fits with what role? I love my niece to death, but after I conquer the world, I'm not putting her in charge of Greenland, no matter how many times she asks me. I should probably explain that a little bit. So my niece obviously knows that I'm going to take over the world someday, and she has a running joke of constantly wanting being put in charge of Greenland. Because she's just really into Greenland summer for some reason. I'm not actually sure. And so she's like, you're going to give me Greenland. I'm like, no. So but no, she would not be a good leader of Greenland. Damn it. And yeah, I agree with that, Ross. But anyways, I'm sorry. So, why not Iceland? I mean, Iceland's pretty legit, but I mean, fish, you know? That's a lot of numbers and accounting dealing with all that fish. So, she rails at her. And then Twilight comes in, Celestia comes in Twilight's appearance. I'm serious. She's just moved into Celestia's role, which I'm fine with. Again, it's just, here, let me fix all this. And let me give you some good advice. And then Starlight's like, man, I'm so sorry. I'm kind of in the wrong here. What's interesting is I actually don't really agree with that. I don't think Starlight is really in the wrong here. Yeah, they did anger very well with Starlight. Credit to the actress, too, who did a wonderful job of that. There's shouting, and then there's anger. We've talked about that before. There's temper, and then there's anger. When you are actually... Well, obviously everyone's different. But usually actual anger isn't shouting. Actual anger is a lot colder than that. Shouting is frustration. Shouting is temper. Shouting is hurt. Shouting is fear. They're not listening to you, or maybe something's going wrong, or you just don't understand, or whatever. But real anger, usually in my exposure to people, tends to be a lot colder and a lot quieter. So, Starlight goes and says she was wrong, which, interesting enough, even though she was not wrong, she is right to say she's wrong. Okay, let me walk that back a little bit. One of the most important things about friendships in general is being willing to reach out further than the other person. And that's what Starlight does here. It's like, hey, look. And Trixie's like... And then the two talk it out, and hey, guess what? They're actually friends, so they make up. I'm just going to move past that, but it's a good thing. I mean, if we're going to have a straight-up actual friendship break in Season 9, I would probably ding that. So instead, it turns out Octavia and Dr. Who's bow out. Oh, yeah, that sucks. And this is when we bring Sunburst in. Flurry Heart's growing. And then they decide to ask Trixie to go ahead and be the counselor, which actually is probably a pretty good fit for her. Oh, sure, she's going to be like, blah, blah. But as we've already demonstrated, Trixie does actually give a damn. As we've already shown. And Starlight actually flat out does admit, hey, what you did with Gallus and standing up for him was absolutely in the right. And yeah, she can also grow more to spend more attention on the students that she's counseling, that she does care about. Yeah, and yeah, no one's ever stood up. Oh, just, yeah. So I like that. And again, good nepotism. If you could even call it that. Then the episode ends. Phyllis, no! Which is not a wah-wah, by the way. That's hysterical is what that is. That is comedic timing. And then just chop. That's a good question, Lord Harriman. I don't know. Admittedly. I will say Trixie would not be a perfect fit. Like, I would not pick her first for something like a counselor job. But I would like to think that Trixie could grow into it more. I might be just too idealistic on that. I'm not sure. So yeah, how do we rate this one? This episode, this is a funny one. This episode is by Ariel Shepard Oppenheim, who, if I'm not mistaken, I'm going to double check this, has never written an episode before. Like, where the heck did this person come from? And how did they just suddenly write this episode? Probably Triaxia. Because you're right, there's a lot of similarity vibes there going. Okay, so let's see. So, she is a writer. She's written for Rainbow Rangers, don't know what that is. Vampirina, don't know what that is. And Solar Opposites. And that's kind of it. Wow. Yeah, and she only wrote the one episode, I am correct. And yeah, there's a couple of small issues in the episode. I'm not going to lie about that, but this is blue or red. It's a hell of a range. This is really good. Like, I'm willing to be talked into purple range for this. Because it's a great character piece for multiple characters and actually really fulfills in a lot of things arc-wise and character growth-wise. It shoves Twilight forward, it shoves Starlight forward, it shoves Trixie forward. They have great dynamic between each other. The comedic timing and usage was fantastic. We got some good background characters, which got good spotlight. There's good thematic meat. It's a requirement for a purple. There has to be something to really chew on, and we've been talking about this episode for 45 minutes. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think we're going to go ahead and give this a purple. Good job, man. Just, I know you will never see this particular review or this analysis or discussion of your episode, but you did a really good... What's funny is this happened occasionally on Trek. Every now and again, they would bring in a guest writer. And what's funny is you can always tell the good contract writers from the bad ones, because a good contract writer will do this. And this happened in Trek. A good contract writer will say, okay, do the research, do the research, do the research. This is what we should do. And what do we get out of that? Wrath of Khan. Written by someone who has never even seen Trek before writing that episode, or writing that movie. You know? Anywho. As mentioned, we are going to go ahead and cover a third episode today. In order to try and line up the season finale a little bit neater. So we're going to go ahead and cover Daring Doubt, which is next. I'm going to turn on my second fan because it's hot today. Here we go. So I'll see you all in about 25 minutes.